So this video focuses on a portion of a chapter of William James's book titled Pragmatism. The chapter is the second chapter titled What Pragmatism Means, and the section I want to focus on concerns pragmatism as a method. The entire chapter itself deals with the various meanings of pragmatism, and so pragmatism can be conceived as a method, an attitude, a general philosophical approach, or a theory of truth. But in this particular video, what I want to focus on is thinking about pragmatism specifically as a method. So let's jump right into it. Let's start where James starts with an example. James recounts a camping trip he took where, when he was returning from a solitary stroll, he found his fellow campers engaged in a debate. The discussion involved a squirrel hanging on the trunk of a tree and a human on the other side. Whenever the human tried to scurry to one direction to get sight of the squirrel would make compensatory moves so that the human could never get on the same side as the squirrel, and so could never really see the squirrel. So the debate concerned whether the human got round the squirrel. So there's two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that the human did get around the squirrel. The second is the human did not get around the squirrel. According to James, the discussion had been worn threadbare, and everyone had taken sides and was obstinate, and the numbers on both of the sides were even. Each side, when I appeared, James writes, therefore appealed to me to make it a majority. So we'll get to the answer to this question, but my kind of question to you, at least for now, or to think about is, which side would you take? Would you take the side that says, yes, the human did get round the squirrel, or the side that says the human did not get round the squirrel? So James says that the pragmatic method is primarily a method of settling metaphysical disputes that otherwise might be interminable. So, some examples might be, is the world one thing, or is it composed of many things? Are we fated or free? Or is our nature purely material, spiritual, or some combination? And so James seems to suggest that the use of pragmatism as a method allows for us to answer these types of questions by settling them. James's statement concerning how the method of pragmatism works is pretty simple or straightforward. He says that we simply need to ask ourselves, in what respects would the world be different if one hypothesis or idea or theory is true rather than another hypothesis or idea or theory? So how would the world look different? What experiential facts would be different? What are the concrete consequences of one theory being true as opposed to another? Another way of phrasing this is, what would be the practical differences? What would be the sensory differences? What would be the experiential differences? What would be the reactions that we would see in the world if one idea is true rather than the other? So pragmatism as a method says that if there's not a concrete, experiential, practical difference between two ideas, then there's no real or meaningful difference. The difference is purely related to how the ideas are presented, or they're purely verbal, or they're purely arise, or we think that they're the case because of some feature of language. Let's return to James's example involving the squirrel. I noted that James claims that pragmatism can provide a way of resolving these types of debates. To do this, we only need to unpack the practical effects of each hypothesis. We do this by taking each idea or hypothesis to be true and then ask ourselves, well, what would the world look like? What would the effects be? What would the practical difference be to us if that hypothesis or idea were true? Let's assume hypothesis 1 is true. This was the position that the human does go around the squirrel. If hypothesis 1 is true, then the practical effects of going around the squirrel, that is what we should expect to see in the world, must mean that the human was, at successive moments, north, east, south, and west of the squirrel. And so if we assume hypothesis 1 is true, then this is the concrete effect, the practical difference the truth of this hypothesis makes to us. Now let's assume hypothesis 2 is true. This was the position that the human does not go around the squirrel. If hypothesis 2 is true, the practical effects of going around the squirrel must mean that the human was, at successive moments, in front of the squirrel, to the left of the squirrel, in the back, behind the squirrel, and then to the right of the squirrel. And so, again, if we assume hypothesis 2 is true, then this is the concrete effect. This is the practical difference the truth of this hypothesis makes to us. So for James, using pragmatism as a method shows the debate about the squirrel to be a purely linguistic disagreement. Both sides are right and both sides are wrong, depending upon what practical effects of going round are taken to be. If the practical effect of going around is taken to be being north, east, south, west of the squirrel, then one side is correct and the other side is wrong. However, if the practical effect of going around is being to the front, side, behind, and then to the other side of the squirrel, then the other side is correct. So I think it's helpful to look at two different cases in which the pragmatic maxim or the pragmatism as a method can be applied. The first is where two ideas seem to be presented differently. It looks like we have two different ideas in front of us, or two different hypotheses or theories. But when we apply the pragmatic maxim, what we see is that there's no practical, sensory, reactive, concrete difference between the two ideas. That is, the world would look exactly the same way if one idea were true and the other one were false, and the other idea were true and the other idea were false. So we're led to the same practical outcome, even though both of the ideas appear to be different, even though there seems to be some disagreement when we look to the practical consequences. There's no factual or empirical difference between the two ideas. An example of this is one that James mentions about what causes bread or dough to rise. We might consider two different hypotheses concerning the rising of the dough. First, there's the hypothesis that an evil spirit caused it to grow. Second, there's the hypothesis that a benevolent or good spirit caused it to grow. Now, there looks to be two different ideas or hypotheses here. One refers to a good spirit and the other one refers to an evil spirit. But notice that they have the same pragmatic consequence. That is, if we assume the first hypothesis is true about the good spirit and the second is false, then the effect of the first spirit, what would be the case if we assumed it to be true, is that dough rises or that the dough will grow. If we assume the second hypothesis is true and the first one is false, then the effect is the same. That is that the dough grows. So given that they have the same practical effect, that is, the world looks the same regardless of which one is true, for James, they'll have the same meaning. Calling one spirit good or bad, one spirit from the heavens or the depths, or even a spirit at all, doesn't add anything to the meaning of each hypothesis. Remember, the meaning is found in the practical effects, the concrete circumstances, the experiences we would have if one hypothesis was true and the other was false. So neither adjective allows us to distinguish one hypothesis from the other. And so saying that one is good or bad is a purely verbal addition, since the whole meaning of the hypothesis is found in its practical effects, namely, it's that which causes dough to rise. In short, for the pragmatist, since the meaning is found in the practical effects, and both hypotheses have the same practical effects, both hypotheses have the same meaning, and so what looks like two different hypotheses or two different ideas is in fact the same idea. I think the second case where the pragmatic maxim might apply is where it looks like we have the same idea. And usually this occurs when there's the same word being put forward. So we have the same idea, but when we think about the practical consequences or the concrete differences for one particular hypothesis to be true or one particular idea to be true and the other one false, what we see is what seems like the same idea is at work here actually yields us to different practical consequences. So we have the same idea, or what looks to be the same idea, but different practical consequences once the pragmatic maxim is applied. In discussions about competitive events, individuals are often compared. We talk about the best basketball player, the best chess player, the best esports figure, actress, and so forth. In those discussions, people often discuss who is, quote unquote, the best. And so it appears as though we are using a term that has a single well-defined meaning. But when we pragmatically analyze the use of the term the best, we see that individuals are often employing different metrics. I might say a particular basketball player is the best, but what this would mean is that individual, let's say, has scored the most points and has won the most consecutive championships. This is the practical effect, the concrete consequence of being the best. However, someone may disagree with me and say another basketball player is the best, but what this would mean is that that individual contributed the most to their team's performance in terms of passing, assists, steals, rebounds, or some criteria that's outlined. For them, this is the practical consequence, the practical effect that would appear in the world if that individual is the best. So what we have here is one term, the best, what looks like one idea, but two different practical effects, two different ways the world would look if you assume one is true as opposed to the other. And so according to the pragmatist, we have different meanings here, even though there's one word. And so at least some disagreement about who is the best or debates about competitive events is really pointless because it's just a purely verbal disagreement. And we can see this when we pragmatically analyze these terms. I think one final example we're thinking about concerns the two different hypotheses about whether or not reality as a whole is an illusion. So one hypothesis or idea or theory might be we live in some type of simulation. The world is a matrix, or we're all just brains in vats, and being a brain in a vat, it creates what we perceive, what we experience. And the other hypothesis is that we're not brains and vats, that this reality as a whole is not a mere simulation. But now think about applying the pragmatic maxim to these two different hypotheses or ideas. When we think about the concrete effects, when we think about the sensory differences, when we think about the experiential effects, it really makes no difference to us, or to anyone for that matter, whether this is a simulation or everything is how it is. It's not a simulation. I still behave the same way. Things look the same way. I still have the same feelings. There's really no difference between world as a simulation hypothesis and world as not a simulation hypothesis. So the pragmatic maxim, or the use of pragmatism as a method, would say that since there's not a practical difference between these two hypotheses, the difference is purely theoretical, purely verbal. There's not a meaningful difference. And so both of the hypotheses essentially mean the same thing. They are the same kind of belief.